Welcome to On the Money, the show about community economic justice in New York City. On the Money is presented by NEDAP, the Neighborhood Economic Development Advocacy Project, which promotes economic justice in New York City and is a resource institution for community-based organizations throughout the city. I'm your host, Mark Winston Griffith, and today I'm going to be talking about the dynamics of gentrification and displacement and how they affect the community of Bushwick, Brooklyn. With me today is Rick Echevarria, who is the Associate Director of BHIP, the Bushwick Housing Independence Project. I got that right?
Yes.
Rick? Okay, cool. So, Rick, why don't we talk very quickly about what BHIP is, what led to its formation?
BHIP is primarily an anti-displacement initiative that started about 4 or 5 years ago, working on housing issues out of a local church in Bushwick, St. Barbara's Roman Catholic Church. And basically it was a project started by myself and Monsignor John Powis, the then pastor. And on a very small scale, what we were doing then was responding to eviction cases that were coming into the rectory that were going unaddressed, in the sense that the tenants did not have any access to legal representation or information about how to defend themselves in housing court.
Right. And so all this is happening in Bushwick. If you can give viewers a profile, an idea of what is happening in Bushwick, and what does Bushwick look like for someone who's to to walk into Bushwick tomorrow?
Well, it's interesting that you say Bushwick tomorrow. There's probably two competing visions of Bushwick. Bushwick as a struggling community, which is very much a reality, and Bushwick as a desirable community, the Bushwick of tomorrow, that is really also part of Bushwick. Bushwick is definitely gentrifying, but there still remain a majority of the families in Bushwick who are struggling with housing issues, struggling to maintain their housing, struggling to stay within the community that they've known and loved for years.
I mean, give us an idea of the sort of socioeconomic landscape, the political landscape, for the uninitiated.
Bushwick is located in North Brooklyn. The community is comprised of 70% Latino families. Over 35% of them fall under some form of poverty as defined by the federal government. 20% of the community is comprised by African American members. And an interesting dynamic in terms of how you see community change and gentrification is that over the last 10 to 15 years, Bushwick has seen a large influx of Latino families from places like Mexico and Ecuador and Central America generally, that have come to join what has largely been, over the last 20 to 30 years in Bushwick, a large Puerto Rican community and Dominican community.
And since I know that BHIP concentrates obviously mostly on housing issues, give me a taste of what's happening there in terms of housing. We've talked a lot on this show in the past about predatory lending, the phenomenon of abusive, discriminatory, fraudulent mortgage lending and real estate practices going on throughout the city. And I know that it affects Bushwick. Could you describe that a little bit?
I can speak for hours about that, but I'll try to contain it to a couple of minutes. Predatory lending is traditionally seen as having a victim being a borrower, a homeowner borrower. What people fail to see, and what we've experienced at BHIP, is that tenants suffer when landlords, whether they be landlords of small properties or large properties, cannot maintain their housing or their properties for some either affordability problem or because of some kind of extra legal speculative activities that take place. The bottom line is that predatory lending, whether it occurs to a homeowner or a multifamily investor, impacts tenants, and it impacts them drastically. More often than not, tenants will wind up in housing court wherever a building has been victimized by predatory lending.
Well, break that down a little bit for us, because I know that most people think of predatory lending as something that the owner of a building gets caught up in. If you can go beyond the terminology predatory lending and give a sort of a textbook example of how a tenant has been affected by this.
Well, I think to cover the first part, a homeowner occupant sometimes, very often, has tenants, either in one unit or 2 or 3 units in their property, and when they can't maintain their property or they lose their property due to foreclosure on their mortgage for not making their payments, automatically the tenant's leases are wiped out. So where predatory lending might have a victim in the form of the homeowner, the tenants no longer have any tenancy security. Their leases do not exist. If a bank takes the building over through auction, or if someone purchases the property from the owner or the bank, through foreclosure auction, the tenants are in real danger of not having any security of a place to live immediately. On the multifamily side, while the foreclosure on a property does not impact tenants in their leases, it leads to confusion with ownership, because there are frequent changes and exchanges of the property in terms of ownership.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you brought up the term foreclosure, because it really isn't so much about predatory lending. I mean, it is about predatory lending, but the bottom line is that homes are going into foreclosure, and the people who are living in those homes obviously are at risk as a result of that. So could you talk a little bit about the landlords themselves? I mean, are they victims in these instances? Are they complicit? And what does it look like? What is actually leading to the foreclosure? What kind of activity?
Lending abuses.
And what does that lending abuse look like?
The lending abuse occurs to a potential investor, someone who wants to buy a multi-family property for the first time,
okay,
and they end up taking out a loan that way exceeds what the property is actually worth. The monthly mortgage payments cannot be made because the rental income on the property is not sufficient to cover the mortgage payments. Yet that particular investor obtained that loan, which is basically a predatory loan.
And what makes it predatory? I mean, the person, how did this person get into this situation in the first place?
A lack of information. Sometimes they're lured. Nowadays there are many advertisements and a lot of marketing around trying to attract potential investors, flip a property, learn how to invest in real estate.
When you say flip a property, what exactly does that mean?
Well, the idea that you can buy property and sell it within a short period of time for a profit,
right,
without necessarily having to rely on the rent roll of the property to make a profit. So, and in this day and age, a community like Bushwick, a targeted for gentrification, those short-term periods, 3 months to 6 months or 9 months or a year, can lead to a significant increase in the assumed value of a property. And so over the last 4 to 5 years, Bushwick has been besieged by people who have taken out loans on properties way in excess of what their value is, and have kind of gotten caught and wind up in foreclosure.
So the people who induce them into taking out these loans, is it their intention to have it go into foreclosure in the first place? I mean, talking about flipping, was that the aim in the first place?
Well, when you say the people who induced them to take out the loans,